very much, Vinny. It's good to take a break away from the world of geopolitics and the Middle East that I've been involved in over the last 3 or 4 days and come to a very different area. But having been a diplomat, I can't really get that part of me out of the way. So I want to start with a little story from the time that I was in Damascus very many years ago. I'd done Arabic as my foreign language in Cairo. And the Arabic that we learned, and that's true for other languages also that we learn, it's a very mercenary, functional sort of education in that language where we're expected to be able to read the front page of a newspaper, have basic conversation, and maybe learn a little bit about the vocabulary of that particular geopolitical region. So I could do an essay on the Middle East peace process to pass my language exam, but there was a lot that I didn't know. But I didn't know that I didn't know that until one fine day I reached Damascus and my ambassador says, "Hey, Navdeep, I believe your Arabic is quite okay. I have a meeting this afternoon with the Minister for Economy in Syria, and why don't you come along and interpret?" I said, "Interpret? Okay, we'll give it a shot." The conversation was about India buying different kinds of lentils from Syria, and I had no clue of any kitchen vocabulary whatsoever. And I'm saying this because after that, number one, when in matters of translation, I stuck to Punjabi and English, which are the two languages where I do have decent vocabulary. But second, really to bring out the point that when we learn a foreign language in particular, there are huge limitations of vocabulary, and when you're translating, there are needs for specialized vocabularies. And that's the area that you focus on. You translate Greek and Latin classics into Spanish. And currently you're working on a very specialized area, the philosophy of Stoicism. How do you deal with these challenges and limitations of words? Which ones are the adequate ones?
Well, any student of foreign language knows how basic it is to have a wide vocabulary. And in the field of a very specific genre like philosophy or literature, you need to further develop this, no? and learn a lot about concepts, about metaphors also. If you take into account, for example, that Greek philosophy was translated into Latin by philosophers as Cicero, for example, he had the problem of he didn't have words in the Latin language to develop some Greek concepts, so he had to make some things happen, no? And that's how philosophy was transferred from Greece and to Rome, and later on to our world. Being a Spaniard and translating into Spanish, Spanish is a language coming from Latin, it's quite easy to find the concepts. But the Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus often use a lot of metaphors involving colors, animals, nature, activities, and of course you have to find the right word, which is not always easy because in ancient languages we are not really sure about things like some basic things like color. For example, Homer says in the Odyssey that the color of the sea is something between green, violet, blue. We don't know really what color is that, no? So you have to make your bet how you poetically translate that. Another example, in Marcus Aurelius, you have some kind of fishes or of animals that you can translate in different forms. So you have to make your choice, and you have to bear in mind that there is no perfect translation. Important point is that the message arrives to the audience, and his philosophy is widely understood in Spanish. No? That's my idea, for at least. No?
Arunava, is that something that you run into?
You mean finding equivalence?
Yeah.
Yes, because the two languages that I work into and out of are very different in terms of their cultural roots. So there are very often no equivalents because what lies underneath the words doesn't exist. The emotions, the feelings, the notions. And sometimes when equivalent words exist, they convey completely different things. What does summer mean in India compared to, say, summer to an English-speaking person? Summer in the UK, quite different from summer in the US. quite different from Summit in India. A lady once took me to task for talking about the searing heat of May. So you can imagine.
You know, when I started translating, and having come from a very unrelated background, as I said, I wanted to educate myself a little bit on the subject. So one of the finest little books that I read is by Kate Briggs, and it's called That Little Art. And it makes a very interesting point. She wants to start off on a career in translation, and her mentor and professor tries to dissuade, oh, you can't make a living from translation. That little art, is that what you want to do? And she brings out a very interesting example of a class which is given, a class of 10 students, who are given, each is given a sheet of paper and told that this is a French translation of an English text, and now you guys please rate it and critique it. And they all do, and somebody finds a mistake with the method, somebody with the syntax, somebody with the grammar, and they turn in the sheets, except that the teacher has played a trick on the class. She'd actually given them the originals, and they were critiquing the original, and they were all quite shamefaced because it was a fairly famous author that they were commenting upon. But the point I think Kate Briggs is trying to make is that do we have an inherent prejudice or bias against translation? Do we think that it is inferior to the original, and the original prima facie is a superior art? Radha, you are both an author and a translator, so what's your thought?
Well, it's something I've encountered for so many years, this common perception of translation as a poor shadow of the original text. And it's something one has had to battle and fight. For instance, when you publish a translation, when I first started translating, my name would not appear on the front cover of the book. Although I would say this is my book, this is my translation, for all that it may be a translation of a source text. And eventually I rebelled and I told my publishers that I will not give you my manuscript unless you change your policy. They said, this is our policy. I said, you need to change your policy, and you need to have the translator's name on the cover. And now, every time I write for the same publisher, I remind them that it should be in the contract. It should be in my contract that my name will figure on the cover, because the translation is my work. The source text is not my work, but the book that is a published translation, I claim it as my own. And I feel that this perception of translation as a mere poor copy or shadow overlooks the fact that translation, and I think we are all talking literary translation here. Let's be very clear. We're not talking interpreting or other forms of translation. For literary translation, what is required is a creative imagination. And I say very insistently that translation of a literary kind is a creative process.
Absolutely. Yeah, please, David.
Yeah, I think it's a huge responsibility also to give your voice to a great author, for example. For me, translating Homer or Plato, I do that in my teaching. I must translate with the students, but you're giving your voice, you're lending your voice to some of the greatest authors of all time, the classics. So it's a huge responsibility, and of course it should be acknowledged in the contracts and everywhere. And regarding this idea of little art, I think translation is one of the basics of human history. It's the chain of knowledge is transmitted in translation. So it should be remembered by everyone that human culture is due to translation, as George Steiner pointed out in After Babel. No? It's one of the most important phenomena in humanity, to enable communication between cultures and transcultural knowledge also. No?
Arunava, you've almost completed a century in terms of translations. Big shout out, 100 books. I can't really think of anyone. If this was a cricketer, you'd probably be carrying him around in a bus, open top bus, 100 books translated. Share your thoughts. Did you feel that pressure that, that this is somehow a lesser art?
No, not really. Though, all of us have grown up reading translated works. And the moment someone tells you, oh, but what's lost in translation, and translation is after all not the original. And I tell them, imagine you're living in a world where you've never read Sangam poetry, you've never read 100 Years of Solitude, you've never read Crime and Punishment, you've never even read Murakami's works. Who's living the lesser life? Not you, not me, it's you. So forget it. I mean, it's beyond argument now. I don't think that point needs to be labored anymore. But certainly, having said that, I will say that there can be no translators without writers. You have to have something to translate. But equally, I'm not anymore a huge fan of the idea of the so-called original and its being sacred. I prefer to think of it as the first version of the work chronologically. But maybe the work actually resides somewhere up there, and each of us is putting it in certain languages, dressing it differently. Translation to me, metaphorically, is very much like dancing on a tightrope, much harder than having the entire stage.
I'll keep that in mind next time I'm taking some extra liberties with my grandfather's text and saying, I hope you're okay up there, not frowning at me.
You know that famous story, I don't know if it's apocryphal, when Anantamurthy called up Ramanujam and said, you've translated this sentence in this particular way, this is not what I meant. And Ramanujam told him, that is what you meant.
Arunava mentioned about classics, David. You've been translating from a classical language and some very ancient classics. What's the difference when you're translating from a language that's no longer alive into one which is contemporary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have some friends incidentally translating also the Indian classics, the Upanishad, Mahabharata, etc. And I translate the Greek or the Roman classics. And you face a lot of problems with living languages, of course, but more problems with non-living languages, classical languages, which must bear a lot of footnotes, for example, to explain concepts or to explain characters that nowadays we don't understand. So that gives an extra amount of work for the translation. You have to introduce the work. You have to write a context, something about the style, basically. And yeah, it's like you mentioned Crime and Punishment, or other universal classics. But a classical book, I like very much an Italian writer who said once, Italo Calvino, that a classic is a book that never ends to say what it has to say. So constantly we are going back to them because we look for answers. Some of them are religious books, of course, the Bible, the Upanishad, etc. Some other are masterpieces of literature, like Homer, Virgil, Dante, or Shakespeare. But we're looking for answers there. So you have an extra responsibility in translating them because, okay, they're going to be read through you for the current generation. I try to write for younger generations and to update the language. So I think you have an extra amount of work with, let's say, dead languages, or ancient languages, because you have to have a good knowledge of the language, and you have to try to update old ideas, old metaphors, old way of speaking. So sometimes it's difficult for us to read the Indian classics, the Indian scriptures. They are very poetic or very symbolic. Also the Greek classics, they're far away from us in time, 1,000 years, many thousand years. But we have the mission to read them over and over, which is very, very interesting. Calvino also said another thing, that when you read a classic, you never can say that you're reading it. You are rereading it because it's inside your culture. It's inside your genetic cultural code, which is very interesting also.
In my limited journey in translation, I ran into one peculiar issue which I wanted to run by Radha and the other panelists, which is how do you deal with third language in a two-language translation, that medium that you're dealing with? So in this particular book that I was working on, it's a Punjabi family, but their house help is a Pahari. And so he often lapses into his language and dialect. And at one point, he sings a whole song in Pahari, which is obviously a language that I don't understand, so I have to depend on somebody else to help me first understand what that song is before I can even attempt. How would you deal with it? And I would open it up to the others also. That do you deal with this challenge of third language translation as well?
Definitely in texts by certain writers, one Mahashweta Devi, whose work I've translated and written upon extensively. And she uses different registers of Bangla, but she also uses not just dialect, but words from Hindi, snatches of Hindi film songs. She will use doggerel, she will use nursery rhymes, she will use all and she will bring in other languages. She's used Sautali dialect lines, in her work. So translating that kind of multilingual quality into a language which is English, because English is what I translate into, and it is further removed from Mahashweta's style than any other Indian language, is a challenge. And you have to find your own strategies as a translator. Sometimes you retain some of the original phraseology to give the sense of this source text being not monolingual, but in its own way having elements of multilinguality, and then somehow working in phrases or explanations or brief translations or paraphrases, or sometimes letting the context speak for itself. And as I was saying in a different sessions, I don't mind if a text doesn't explain everything and leaves a few cultural things unexplained and untranslated, and readers have their own imagination and can walk into the text and try and make some meaning, let the text have some secrets. I found this also in the prose of Qazi Nazrul Islam, whose essays I've recently translated. His style is volatile and extraordinary, and it contains elements of, again, different registers of Bangla, but it also includes vocabulary from Persian, from Arabic, from English, from Sanskrit, and it's highly idiomatic and colorful. And this actually led Nazrul himself into a controversy, because in a particular context, he used the word khoon in Bangla instead of rokto, which is the Sanskritized traditional Bangla word. And reportedly, Tagore's circle of admirers who brought out a journal called Shonibare Chithi, they were jealous of Tagore's admiration for the young poet Nazrul, and they wrote in Shonibare Chithi that Tagore had objected to the use of khoon in the Bangla context. And a deeply wounded Nazrul wrote an essay in protest in which he said, and I'll read that passage, he defiantly keeps the Persian Arabic terms, but also brings in the Sanskrit term Kavya Lakshmi for the goddess of poetry. And he says, not only khoon, in my writings I have used many other Arabic Persian words current in Bengali. Let me explain why. I feel that Kavya Lakshmi, the goddess of poetry who rules the world, has a certain Islamic style. I also don't feel that this attire has diminished her loveliness. Even the late Ajit Chakravarty has praised this style, adorning the Bengali Kavya Lakshmi in a few Iranian ornaments called jewels, this is zevar, does not destroy her caste purity. Rather, she looks even more khubsurat. Her beauty is enhanced.
Arunava, you must have come across this challenge across your many texts. Do you feel the temptation to resort to other devices, italicize or
no, so
interpret?
I'm completely against using italics because we don't speak in italics. Right. So why should we read in italics? Also, if the question is why are these variations being used? If it is to convey the idea of polyphony, then you need to make those sounds be heard in the text. It doesn't matter what language they come from. When I'm reading the Bangla, they're still slightly distanced from me. So when you're reading the English, the sounds can be slightly distant from you. It doesn't matter. On other occasions, maybe the meaning is important. In that case, you use a different register of English to convey that this is not the same register in which the earlier sentence was written. So there's no one size fits all. But it is my firm belief that you can lend words to a language when you're translating into that language, even if it is the loan is only for the duration of that text. Let the language receive these new words, let them make what it will of them, let their readers make what it will of them. The English language did not come from a monolithic root to begin with. In the case of Indian, there are plenty of Indian words which are in English now, and increasingly so. So we can add.
No, but like the example that I gave you of a whole song,
Yeah.
would you translate it into English or would you leave it in Pahari?
It depends on what purpose the song is there for. If it is just to convey that someone is singing in Pahari, you don't need to translate it. But if there's something very meaningful in it, yes. You run into this all the time if you're trying to translate Hindi songs which characters are humming. Because no matter what language you speak in, you often sing Hindi songs. And they can be really stupid in English.
True.
Although they're very soulful in the original. So, what are you going to do? Are you going to make them sound stupid? Or are you going to try and write a line of soulful poetry in English and say, I'm being true to the source because I'm giving you the emotion rather than the specific words?
David, one of the hardest things I find is a joke or an idiom, translating that into another language, because sometimes these are so rooted in a soil, in a context, in a society, that without providing a lengthy explanation of what the guy is trying to say, you'll have that horrible phrase again, lost in translation, right? How would you deal with that?
Well, it depends on the case, but I mostly agree with you, with my colleagues. I tend to leave it in the original. Typical footnote of translator is in Spanish in the original, or because it has a function in the literary work to leave that in another language. So basically, it would be inclined to leave it like that, no? And maybe to explain it somewhere. No? But as I said, you have to see case by case. It's very different scenario, what can happen. In the case of classical languages, sometimes in literary works you have quotations in Latin, in Greek, in Sanskrit. I think you have to leave it like that because they are the reference language to everyone, no, in the culture. That being said, I think that translation is a very creative process. No, you have to face every case and see what you decide. No, you have a choice, and creativity of the translation is there it's a challenge, no? And it's also very productive for culture in general. I was saying before. Culture and civilization has progressed through translation. So sometimes some choices we make are very important for the future. Can you imagine, for example, the Christian prayer, Our Father, when it was translated from Greek into Latin, some choices were made, choices that were philosophically, theologically very important, huh? And it changed partially the meaning of it. Huh? Or when the prayer was translated into Spanish, into German, there are some nuances. For example, in philosophy and in religion, translation can change everything. So, and you have to make choices because sometimes in your language, that concept didn't exist. There are many anecdotes regarding the Bible, for example. The Bible was translated into American languages in regions where, for example, the lamb didn't exist. No? So how you explain the expression "Lamb of God" no? Among peoples that doesn't have a lamb and they don't know what a lamb is? So maybe you have to be creative. No? I had wonderful solutions, like in North America, the seal, this animal, sea animal, is used also as a lamb. It's a symbol of so maybe you have to say seal of God instead of lamb of God. No? We translators need to be creative sometimes and find solutions case by case. No?
And does translation continue to enable us to build bridges with other cultures in terms of transmission of knowledge, as was historically the case, or are we going beyond that today? When you look at the past, there was a session the other day here on Nalanda as the greatest library and the greatest storehouse of knowledge with texts from all over. Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad was famed for the way the caliphs Harun Rashid and Mansur got translators to translate the Greek texts and the Sanskrit texts. It's a trend that we've seen historically, and yet today we are also seeing a bit of exceptionalism where each culture, each one thinks I'm superior. Would you say that we still need this art as much as we did in the past, Arunav? More than ever before?
Are we still asking that question?
Yeah.
Yes, we need it more and more every single day. There's more being written, and more languages are being represented through written works, through oral works. What words are no longer limited to books. You now see them in text messages, you see them on social media. And if we are not going to understand that the world is not just a single place, then why are we even here? We absolutely need more and more translators, and the more the merrier, I say. And I'm happy for, if I don't know if you're going to ask this question, but if artificial intelligence, it's not intelligent yet, to be honest. It's massive data processing, right? But if artificial intelligence tools, as they're called, get to a point where they can do a fine job of translating untranslated text, I think the world will be so much the richer for it.
No trade unionism here. Arunav is not worried about his job diminishing. He's happy for the word at large, that you will have many more texts and that will be available to you to read. David, you mentioned a very interesting thing. You said classics should be translated every 20 years or so. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, first of all, let me add to this question before. That some of the most amazing cultural enterprises in history are these multicultural libraries, no? Like you mentioned Baghdad, Alexandria, even Cordoba, no? Where classics and works from all languages were translated into other languages. For example, I quoted the Bible before, or the Egyptian history into Greek in Alexandria. Because there you see, or Aristotle into Arabic, no, in Baghdad, there you see how culture advances. So that's why, answer to your question, that's why we need to revisit the classics every once in a while, because time changes and new generations need new voices. No, for example, some of your authors you have translated for the first time into other language. No, okay, I'm translating the Odyssey. No, the Odyssey was translated hundreds of times. In the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 19th century, by many translators with many cultural backgrounds. We need translation nowadays for younger people, no? And even in 20 years' time, things change a lot. The language of the people changes a lot. So that's why I think we should never cease with this enterprise of translating the basics of our cultures, no? Let's say the Indian classics, the Chinese classics, the Russian classics, over and over, because they have messages for us there, waiting for us, and we need to update them for the new generations. I teach at university translation. We just sit down there with Plato, with Homer, and we read them in Greek. And we try to translate them for current people, no? For current generation. And I find it surprising how young people understand things in a different way, or words have different nuances. I don't know, modern questions as gender studies or this artificial intelligence. They raise new questions also for translation. I think that's why I think we should revisit the classics every 20 years. That would be ideal, no? But maybe more.
You know, a friend of ours has started with this unhappy presumption that the younger generation, which looks at only its phone and WhatsApp, can no longer read a full book. at least many of them. Not JLF company excluded, of course. You are here because you read books. But he starts with that presumption, and he says, but you still need to read classics. As Arunava said, without the classics, wouldn't you be poorer? But if you're not going to read whole books, his solution is, can we comicize the classics and make them kind of bite-sized so that younger audiences or today's audiences with limited attention spans can also consume them, even if in an abbreviated or a comicized form. Any thoughts on that? Radha?
Well, I think abridged versions have existed even in our childhood. And I think our earliest encounters with some heavy-duty classics came in the form of oral storytelling from grandparents, followed by picture book versions. And I think we had the classics illustrated. None of you were born then, but we had those priceless illustrated comic book versions of the classics, and not in the same sense as comic books today. But those images still remain very vivid in our minds. And then we came to reading the abridged versions, and it was only later that we came to read the full book. So the book stayed with us, but mutated through various editions and versions as we grew more mature. And that's how classics endure and live on with you and in your heart and in your mind. And books have always been there, adapting to the needs of different age groups. But today, the media available to us are so much more varied. And so it is so easy now to convert from one medium to another. And here we are shading off from translation into adaptation, and the thin borderline between the two, the rather gray borderline between the two. But I do believe that all media should interact, and any way of, letting these priceless texts reach newer and newer generations, what's wrong with that? I think we have to move with the times.
Where he adds an additional layer of complexity, I guess, is that his reckoning that it used to take maybe 2 years to produce a Kafka into a comicized version because of the sheer amount of work involved. But today you've got AI-driven tools which can create a template, or you can approve a template and then you can replicate it across the text. And so there is human intervention, but there's also technology coming in. So what used to take 2 years, maybe you can do it in 2 weeks. Arunava, would you support that?
Okay, first of all, there's no great virtue in doing in 2 weeks what actually needs 2 years. When you really look at the long time scale, what's the difference? Two, great literature does not lie in the meaning of words. It actually lies in what is not on the page. It lies in what you make of those words, right? What is a DeepSeek going to make of those words? What is ChatGPT going to make of those words? They hallucinate. They produce very convincing looking translations, which you then, if you compare to the original, you'll find that, I tried with an Abonindranath Thakur essay, and the program in all its intelligence included 3 quotes by Rabindranath Tagore, which were completely made up, but sounded absolutely authentic. So technologically, we are skating on very thin ice. Secondly, it only captures, it's good with legal documents and where meaning is content is the only thing that matters. But that's not where it is. What do they know of cricket who only cricket know? That's applicable to literature, right? It's everything else. It's where you as the reader are. It's where you live in the world. It's what it means to you vis-a-vis your relationship with the rest of the world. Borges wrote the famous story where Don Quixote gets rewritten 300 years. The man who rewrote Don Quixote, Pierre Menard, the man who rewrote Don Quixote, he rewrote Don Quixote from Spanish into Spanish 300 years later, using exactly the same words, the same punctuation, nothing was changed. And yet Borges showed that the new text meant something completely different. And that's the greatness of a classic. An artificial intelligence program is going to produce one sort of standard version. But no great book can have a standard version. Each of us, we make it as we read it. The translators make it as they read them, which is why, as you said, David, every 20 years a new generation needs it, because they will make of the text what matters to them in their world. Today, every young person will read any text in the context of the impending doom of climate change, for example. Nobody can get away from it, right? You have to do these things. Today, we can discover in Tagore's plays that he was talking about climate change, although we didn't realize it at that time. So, no, technology is not going to be able to do it.
As I said, there's a friend who's embarked on an interesting project. There are many skeptics, and I'm with you.
No, I'm all for these projects. My point is, like, as they say, good money drives out bad money, so good writing will drive out bad writing. But by all means, let there be the bad versions to show us what good versions really are. Sometimes we take good things for granted.
Absolutely. Any last words, David or Radha?
Well, I definitely agree with you. This AI is not capable of reflecting the greatness of literature, of classical literature, for example. Someone said that a classic book, you don't read it; he reads you, no? And he puts you under pressure, and he proves you. No? So I think it can be helpful for some children adaptations, for minor things. No, we can use it, but I mean our task remains to be the same. No, to face translation of a classic. No, which is difficult. Okay, as a kid, I was raised reading mythology, for example, in adapted versions, which is wonderful. Mythology is, I work on mythology still, no? So it's very attractive for kids. You can adapt it in movies, comic books, etc. But sooner or later, you have to be face to face with a great classic, no? Which is not easy. No? Flaubert said also, well, it's difficult, but just spend some time with the classic. It will cost you a lot of time, but try to understand what he has to say, or she has to say for the author to you, no? So the artificial intelligence will never be capable of that, in my view. I don't know, unless the future brings new developments. For the moment being, it's not valid to translate literature, in my opinion. So I agree with you.
Radha, last words?
Well, I don't think that a machine can replace the human soul and the human imagination. And at the end of the day, we may have all kinds of enabling mechanisms of which AI and ChatGPT, which seem so new now, may one day seem very obsolete to the generation sitting in front of us. But I think what needs to be remembered is that I don't think any machine can replicate the human creative imagination or the human soul.
Well, on those optimistic and hopeful words, let me open it up to the floor. Okay. Gentleman in the green shirt in front, and then the girl here, lady here, and then there. Short questions, please.
Yes.
You've got experts, so make it count.
Of course. Because you translate Greek myth, I had a question about, in Iliad, for example, in Robert Fagel's translation, when Patroclus or Antilochus dies, there's descriptions like the dark flowed out of him, referring to blood, right? And when he writes about the wine dark sea, we might not know what the color is, but we know blood is red. So has anything changed from the time Mr. Fagel's translated to now how translators see it? Or is the vagueness a part of the script? How do you think about the classics, particularly Homer's work?
Thank you.
Let me take two more, and yes, young lady here.
Yeah, thank you. I have a very basic but I think a slightly important question, is that especially when we talk about classic texts, let's say Crime and Punishment or Tolstoy, in today's time there are multiple translations that are available, and you cannot interact with everyone, all the translations. So is there certain things that we can be mindful of, certain things to look for, to know that what is a good translation? Because as we have discussed how important it is to have a good translation, to interact as closely as we could with the text.
Okay.
So that's all, thank you.
Lady at the back over there. I'm coming to you, sir. I'm coming to you. Yes.
So I know it's a very basic question, but I wanted to ask that, all of you translated so many books. What was the one piece of literature that, made you want to work so hard that, you wanted to translate it into different languages because it felt like the world needs to know about it?
Okay. Let me take one last from there. Yes, the gentleman. Short and sweet, please.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My question has two parts, actually. What is the effective way to translate either from sentence to sentence or read a page and then add your creative imagination and bring in your in a new style which is more effective? Second thing is, right now I'm translating a book of 16 short stories from Telugu to English. So a lot of idioms and constructed by the original author are used in a very typical and different slang belonging to a particular area called Rayalaseema in Andhra Pradesh. I have these two challenges. So I want some light to be thrown by everybody if possible.
Arunava, you want to take that?
This question? Sir, you don't have a single solution. You won't have a single solution for these problems. You'll have to take each one and see how best to deal with it. In some cases, you may need to translate it to an idiomatic English. In another one, you may want to keep a literal translation because it brings out the flavor much more effectively. But on the whole, you need to do something that will bring us an idea of the richness of the original text. But your strategy is your own, and no two translators will do it the same way.
David, on the Greek classics?
Well, I mean, why page by page? Why not story by story? No, I think you'll have to decide what your unit of deconstruction is. For most people, it's sentences. They take it one sentence at a time. But I think it's a bit risky to go page by page because then you may end up doing quite a different version.
David, on the Greek classics?
Yes, regarding Homer, for example, it's a very complicated question because it depends also on the literary fashions of the time of the translation. In the case of these classics, like Virgil, Homer, Cicero, etc., for our civilization, they have taught us how to write. I mean, we have learned rhetoric with Cicero, epic with Homer. So they were translated so many times in so different styles, so different epochs, that there are no single solutions, and there are some more literal solutions, and some other more metaphorical. No? It depends on the fashion. Borges studied, for example, how the translations of Homer into English in a way modeled the literary fashion of the time, neoclassicism, romanticism, realism, etc. And there is another very interesting book about Spanish translation of Homer since the Renaissance until nowadays. And every translator used a different strategy. Some try to adapt the colors, the expressions. Some are shocking to us. For example, in 17th century France, it was not appropriate to read about a king. You imagine the Sun King, no? Cutting a lamb or like a kebab. No? This is not appropriate for a king in France in the 17th century. So you erase that part or you change it a little bit. No? There are many strategies, and it depends on the fashion also. No? Nowadays we tend to be very faithful, very literal, but sometimes we need to use metaphors also to understand, because Homer did, no? And the classics did. No? So I think it's a question of balance also. No? We try to do that in classes of translation. No? To get the full meaning, and it's a big responsibility because you're making a choice always, no? And you have to transmit the passion for these classics. So, regarding all the other question about this, it's not a basic, it's not a simple question. It's a very key question for all translators. No?
Maybe he can discuss it offline with you. The 2 points from there, rather on multiple versions of a particular classic, and maybe you on the favorite book that led you to translation.
Everyone should answer.
So, yes, classics do have multiple versions. I don't think there is one best version, and I don't think you can read through, I mean, you would have to read through different versions to judge for yourself. The thing about reading a version, which is a translated version, is that you cannot access the original. So you're not in a position to really judge how closely it adheres to the source text. So really, it has to convince you, it has to draw you in, and perhaps reading around the text and reading about it to see what, knowledgeable readers have said. But really the test is your own response, because you've asked a very good question which asks you actually to do a comparative analysis, and that for the everyday reader is difficult. But actually that's the only deeper way to go about it.
Arunava, you get the last word.
No, everyone needs to tell us.
Time is up.
Time's up. Well, actually, to be honest, that book I haven't yet translated. I'm not ready for it yet. One day I will be. And then I'll make sure you're the first person to know about it.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you for all for being here.